The final hours of Christmas night drifted through Boulder like a lullaby. Outside, the streets lay hushed beneath a falling veil of snow. Inside, one home on 15th Street, Christmas lights still glowed, a family asleep beneath the afterglow of celebration. All details are drawn from public records, investigative files, and credible reporting. Some descriptions have been softened for tone and sensitivity. The case remains open.
This program contains discussions of real-life crimes and may not be suitable for all audiences. When Darkness Falls is created for educational and awareness purposes, every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, and we tell these stories with deep respect for the victims, their families, and their communities. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to remember, to understand, and to learn.
JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was the youngest child of JonBenét Ramsey and Patricia Ann Paul Ramsey, a bright 6-year-old who loved Christmas, singing, and the pageants her mother entered her in. She had a 9-year-old brother, Burke Robert Ramsey, known for his quiet curiosity and fascination with computers. From John's first marriage came 3 older children, Elizabeth, Beth, John Andrew, and Melinda. Beth tragically died in a car accident on January 8, 1992 at just 22 years old. John Andrew, 20, and recently married Melinda, 26, both living out of state, remained close to their father and often visited for holidays. They had been scheduled to join the family for a New Year's trip to their summer home in Charlottesville, Michigan. Now, John Ramsey was no stranger to success. As president of Access Graphics, a computer distribution company later acquired by Lockheed Martin, he managed hundreds of employees and oversaw multi-million-dollar contracts. Patsy Ramsey once was a celebrated beauty queen, a former Miss West Virginia whose poise and warmth made her beloved in her hometown of Parkersburg. For her daughter, JonBenét, the sparkle of the stage became a shared language between mother and child. Pageants weren't about crowns, they were about connection, sequence, music, and matching smiles beneath Christmas lights, a bond that, to Patsy, felt like magic. Behind the glow of the holidays, Patsy Ramsey was already fighting a private battle, one few outside her family fully understood. In 1993, she'd been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, undergoing a hysterectomy and rounds of chemotherapy. For 9 precious years, the cancer remained in remission. It was a blended household, close, busy, and by all accounts happy. Until that night. By 10:30, the house was quiet in pieces, faint echoes of laughter dissolving into hum. Outside, frost crept along window panes. Inside, the air still held the scent of pine and candle wax. Another Christmas had ended. The Ramseys returned home after spending the evening with close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, and their young daughter Daphne, a close friend of JonBenét. The two families were close. Holiday dinners, shared trips, and the easy comfort of the people who felt like family. On 15th Street, the night had gone still. John carried his daughter upstairs, asleep from the ride, while Patsy lingered below, straightening the last details of Christmas. Burke went upstairs to his bedroom and went to sleep. Years later, in a 2016 interview with Dr. Phil, he recalled waking up in the middle of the night to assemble a new toy he received for Christmas. One of the very few glimpses he'd ever given into that night. The clock neared 11. Snow pressed against the windows. The heater murmured through the vents. In the stillness, every sound felt too loud. The tick of a clock, the creak of wood, a breath. Across the street, a neighbor, Margot Silver, would later say she saw a light still on in the Ramsey kitchen. Just one light glowing faintly in the early hours of December 26. From her bedroom window, Melody Satin later told investigators she awoke to a short, sharp sound, a child's scream, that lasted only seconds. Then the night sealed itself again like ice. Below the decorated rooms was a different quiet, a cold, concrete stillness. Behind a wood-latched door waited darkness no one checked that night. Time slowed to a drift. The world outside slept. Inside, nothing moved. No voices, no sound, only the heavy weight of a house too quiet. Morning crept in through thin curtains. painting the kitchen in cold blue light. Upstairs, the first movement of the day. And then, on the spiral staircase near the kitchen, a mother paused. And the stillness was broken, unaware that her house was about to change forever. Patsy Ramsey claimed she found the note on the staircase leading from the main level up to the second floor, or on the bottom step of the spiral staircase near the kitchen. It was long, full of threats and strange formality. The handwriting was deliberate, the tone almost performative. It demanded $118,000, close to the net amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. To some investigators, that detail felt like coincidence. To others, it sounded like knowledge from someone who knew the family well. According to an interview with Patsy,
the note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads, and it was kind of dimly lit. It was very early in the morning, and I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, "Mr. Ramsey," and it said, "We have your daughter." And it just wasn't registering, and I may have gotten through another sentence like, "Okay, we have your daughter," and I don't know if I got any further than that. And I immediately ran back upstairs and pushed open her door, and she was not in her bed, and I screamed for John.
When she thought she'd hung up, the line stayed open, catching faint, overlapping voices the world would later dissect frame by frame.
911 emergency. Police. What's going on? 515th Street. What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's blonde. 6 years old.
How long ago was it?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Patsy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been gone?
No, I don't. Please, we just got up and she right here. Oh my God, please.
Okay, well,
Please, somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath,
Please,
okay?
hurry.
Patsy.
One of the first officers on scene, Officer French, performed a swift room-by-room search of the main living areas. When he came to the basement door, he did not enter. The door was described as being latched or secured in a way that suggested it had been secured from the outside or was simply closed. Crucially, French later stated his professional assumption was that if a perpetrator was inside, they would not have been able to lock the door from the interior and trap themselves. Based on this reasoning, he turned away, leaving the basement unsearched during this initial sweep. Now moving upstairs, the officer checked the windows and doors, looking for evidence of a break-in. He specifically noted finding no sign of forced entry anywhere on the upper floor or main level. Additionally, despite the presence of snow outside, he observed no footprints in the snow immediately surrounding the house that would indicate an intruder had recently entered or fled the premises. Family friends were called for support. Fleet White and his wife Priscilla arrived soon after, the house filled with voices, coffee cups, and quiet prayers. Police did not isolate the scene. Each gesture of comfort shifted the timeline in ways they would later regret. The note promised a call between 8 and 10 o'clock. No call came. Detectives hesitated, unsure if they were waiting for a kidnapper or standing inside of a crime scene they didn't yet understand. Around 1 p.m., FBI Special Agent Ron Walker advised Detective Linda Arnett to have the entire house searched from top to bottom. Arnett relayed the instruction to John Ramsey to keep John occupied and under watch. Almost immediately after receiving the instruction, John and family friend Fleet moved with unexpected speed and purpose. Rather than beginning a systematic search on the main floor or upper levels, they headed directly for the basement. He reached the wine cellar door, the one left unopened by Officer French. Inside, the air was cold and still. On the floor beneath a white blanket was his daughter, JonBenét. Her hands were bound above her head with cord. She was wearing long johns and underwear. However, she had been put to sleep in a pink quilted nightgown. Now, there are reports of her having a bedwetting incident, so that could be why she's wearing something different. Record isn't very clear. A garrote made from nylon rope and a broken paintbrush handle were tied around her neck. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth. In those few seconds, the procedure met heartbreak. John Ramsey tore the tape from her mouth, trying to help her breathe. He attempted to untie the cords around her wrists, but the knot wouldn't give. So he lifted her, still wrapped in the white blanket, with her pink nightgown clinging to it, and carried her upstairs. In doing so, the scene was changed forever. The garrote, the tape, the position of the body, all altered by a father who wasn't thinking like a witness, but like a parent. The instrument used to strangle JonBenét, known as a garrote, was fashioned from a length of nylon cord and a broken, round piece of wooden paintbrush handle. Later, investigation confirmed that the brush end of the paintbrush, which was broken off and missing its handle, was found in a tub of Patsy's art supplies. These supplies were typically stored in the basement. The morning after the discovery, snow covered the Ramsey home like nothing had happened. Inside, detectives moved in silence. The family was gone. The house was finally sealed as a homicide crime scene shortly after 1:05 p.m. on December 26, 1996. Some police timelines reference the house being cleared except JonBenét's body, and police being stationed outside to guard the doors by 2:35 p.m., signifying the site was under official lockdown. The coroner ruled her death a homicide, asphyxia by strangulation with associated cranial trauma. No sign of conventional sexual assault, yet injuries that raised new questions. Trace debris, cord, fabric, wood, and a fragment of fruit in her stomach. Now, on the Ramsey's kitchen table sat a bowl of pineapple with Patsy's fingerprints on it. Foreign male DNA was found under JonBenét's fingernails, on her underwear, and on the waistband of her long johns. It belonged to no one in the Ramsey family. Years later, this profile would become the cornerstone of the family exoneration, evidence of an unknown intruder whose identity remains a mystery to this day. By afternoon, Boulder police held their first press conference. Detective Commander John Eller called the family cooperative. Behind the podium, that cooperation was already unraveling. John Andrew Ramsey later reflected on those first chaotic days.
My father, myself, we all marched into that police station, gave blood, we gave hair, we gave fingerprints. The thing that really stuck with me is two detectives hand me their business cards, and one says narcotics officer and the other says auto theft. And I bury my head in my hands because I knew at that point we were in a bad spot. Boulder police didn't have the resources to solve a complex homicide.
Within days, the case fractured into competing theories, some pointing inward, others outward. The Boulder police focused on family dynamics, inconsistent statements, and staging. Others, including Detective Lou Smith, began to see the outlines of something else, a calculated intrusion, a predator no one had seen coming. Detectives also looked outward, investigating anyone with proximity to the family or unusual behavior. Family friends Fleet and Priscilla White were questioned at length and a minimum of 5 times. A neighbor known as Santa, Bill McReynolds, was interviewed after playing Santa Claus at the Ramsey Christmas party.
There's no way in the world that I could be involved in the death of this little girl.
Bill, the man who had portrayed Santa Claus at several Ramsey family events, became an early focus of public speculation.
I was the Santa Claus for 3 years at their party, and I always liked the Ramsey party, so I called Patsy in particular and said it's time for a party.
He was a retired journalism professor and a longtime friend of the Ramseys, having participated in pageants and parties organized by Patsy. 5 days before JonBenét's death, McReynolds had played Santa at the White family's Christmas gathering, where JonBenét reportedly gave him a small gift. McReynolds and his wife Janet later said that they had given JonBenét a religious medallion and a poem referencing sleep and angels. Investigators noticed unsettling coincidences. A year earlier, Janet McReynolds had written a Christmas play that included a scene where a girl named JonBenét asked a Santa figure to fetch her a scarf from a white paper bag, language that faintly echoed a detail in the ransom note. The note signature, SBTC, even sparked speculation and met Santa Bear that cares. Bill McReynolds cooperated fully with police. He provided handwriting and DNA samples, and both he and his wife were questioned about the play. His DNA did not match the unidentified male profile found on JonBenét's clothing. Investigators officially cleared him. The so-called Santa suspect line of inquiry ultimately proved to be a red herring, though it underscored the tangled coincidences surrounding the case. Another man, Gary Oliva, drew scrutiny due to his proximity to Boulder and disturbing behavior. Oliva was a drifter living just blocks from the Ramseys' home at the time of the murder. Friends later told police he had shown an unhealthy fixation on JonBenét, once calling her a beautiful child whose death broke my heart. Over the years, Oliva made several unsettling statements suggesting guilt, including letters in which he implied involvement. However, DNA testing ruled him out. Despite repeated public speculation, Oliva was never charged in connection with the crime. Another suspect was Michael Helgoth, who was one of the more unusual figures to pass through the early investigation. He was 26, worked at a junkyard less than a mile away from the Ramsey home, and had a reputation in Boulder for volatility and questionable association. A co-worker later claimed Helgoth had talked about coming in a large sum of money, coincidentally close to the amount demanded in the ransom note. That alone didn't make him a suspect, but it put him on the radar of both police and private investigators. Tension around his name escalated in January 1997 when the Boulder District Attorney's Office publicly announced that they had narrowed their list of suspects.
The list of suspects narrows. Soon there will be no one on the list but you.
It wasn't a direct accusation, but the timing mattered. 2 days after that press conference, Helgoth was found dead of what authorities ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The proximity of the announcement and his death fueled speculation, especially among those who favored the intruder theory. To them, it looked like a man panicking as the investigation was closing in. At the same time, rumors were circulating about an audio recording supposedly tied to Helgoth, one in which a voice was said to brag, "We killed a girl and got away with it." No such authenticated recording ever surfaced, but it kept his name in conversation. Private investigators also linked him to possible break-ins in the area, adding another layer of suspicion. Ultimately, though, none of it held. When Helge's DNA was tested after his death, it did not match the unidentified male DNA from the case. Investigators eventually ruled him out, concluding that the Helgoth lead was less a concrete trail and more a product of rumor, circumstantial timing, and the public's hunger for answers in a case that felt increasingly unsolvable. Years later, in 2006, the case flared back into headlines when John Mark Carr, a former schoolteacher, confessed from Thailand to being present when JonBenét died. He claimed his death was accidental and that he loved her. The confession triggered an international frenzy, but when Carr was extradited to Boulder, his story unraveled. He knew no verified details about the house or the crime scene. His DNA did not match the unknown profile. Charges were dropped, and his confession was deemed false, likely the product of delusion or a need for attention. Now that weekend, the Ramseys left Boulder behind. On December 29th, John piloted his own private jet, carrying family and close friends to Georgia. They were headed to Marietta, where JonBenét would be buried beside her half-sister Beth, killed 5 years earlier in a car crash. While the Ramseys buried their daughter, investigators quarreled. Some sources stated that the notepad and Sharpie pen were found in the kitchen area of the home. Other accounts, specifically from forensic scientist Harry Lee, mentioned the pad came from Patsy's desk in the hallway, and the pen was found underneath the phone. No sign of forced entry, no foreign prints, no intruder in sight, and yet, a ransom note written on paper from their own home. Investigators noted Patsy's history with cancer and the physical toll her treatments had taken. Her defense would later argue that even composing such a lengthy note might have been physically difficult for her. So what was left? Just a family and a letter that seemed to come from within their own walls. As the focus narrowed, tensions rose, and the cracks began to show. In early January, the DA's office called to help. Lou Smith came out of retirement to assist. Methodical and soft-spoken, he studied every photo and report. Within days, he believed the evidence pointed outside the family, toward an intruder no one else had seen. A new year began, but the air in Boulder remained unsettled. The press called it the Christmas murder. Detectives called it chaos. And for the first time, the city wondered if truth and justice would ever meet again. The case was still open, but the room felt closed. And from that stillness, another tone took hold, one that would carry through everything that followed. Inside those walls, two teams studied the same files and saw two different truths. Detectives followed chronology and forensics. Prosecutors followed holes and uncertainty. Notes turned into records of disagreement. Nobody raised a voice, but the pause after each sentence was long enough to hear what wasn't being said, and from that silence, distrust took shape, moving down a corridor like cold air through a vent. The pressure wasn't in headlines, it was in the hallways. One detective boxed his papers before sunrise. Another found a transfer notice with no signature. Everyone said the same thing: procedure. No one believed it. Discipline became a shield against blame, and somewhere beneath the quiet experts and the careful language, the case kept waiting time. Because outside those walls, another audience was waiting. The story had escaped the station. Microphones waited where evidence should have been. The Ramseys learned to pause before every word. Detectives learned to say nothing at all. Reporters filled the space between them with theories. In living rooms across the country, the trial had already begun, and no one had been charged. Inside, the same silence kept spreading, and not even rank could contain it. Requests for follow-up stalled in inboxes. Each delay looked strategic, each question personal. There were no joint briefings now, just parallel statements, delivered like rivals sharing the same microphone. The walls weren't made of brick anymore. They were made of careers to protect, and when no one wanted to risk theirs, progress stopped belonging to anyone. That's when Lou Smith walked back into the story. He came with no allegiance, only a reputation for solving what others had already given up on. For weeks he worked alone, mapping the case in silence. His notes were precise, his faith unbroken. He didn't argue with the department or the press. He argued with the evidence.
"Something's not right,"
he wrote, then underlined it.
"Find what doesn't fit."
It was the beginning of a new investigation and the end of an old one. Lou Smith unlocked the door himself. Boxes lined the floor, photographs, maps, fibers, plastic doll with missing hair. The air smelled like cardboard and chemicals. He walled the time, adjusted his glasses, and began again piece by piece. In his notebook he wrote,
"Start fresh. Ignore conclusions. Listen to what the evidence wants to say."
He rebuilt the basement scene from memory and photographs. Distances, sightlines, angles of dust. Every photo became a question. Why had the flashlight shown no prints? Why had a cord matched a brush that belonged upstairs? He sketched the layout on transparent film, layering each piece until the patterns overlapped. Lou wrote,
"The story the evidence tells is quiet but not silent."
He compared fibers from duct tape, blanket, and clothing. None formed a clean match. Red, blue, pink, brown. Ordinary colors that shouldn't have traveled together. He marked the column unresolved migration. When he looked up, the room had grown dark. Note to self.
"The small things are loud if you stop arguing long enough to hear them."
He studied the window, the suitcase, the cobweb, zoomed in until dust looked like snowfall. Each photo held a contradiction. Details too neat for chaos, too careless for precision. He circled each anomaly in red pencil. Then, beneath it, wrote only one word. Staged journal entry. February 1997.
"If truth is buried, it will breathe through the seams."
His reports met resistance before they met review. Requests returned unsigned. Meetings postponed without reason. Lou kept copies of everything, not for leverage, but for memory. He wrote,
"We should be on the same side of the tape."
The silence that followed told him he wasn't. Some nights he stayed past midnight. He wrote to keep the case human.
"A child should never be the battlefield,"
he noted.
"If I lose Faith, she becomes another file."
Between the lines were sketches, window frames, rope knots, the curve of the small wrist. When he finished, closed the book without signing his name. By spring, the conversation shifted. There would be no consensus, only procedure. Inside the Boulder Police Department, the case had reached a kind of stalemate. Not because the file was empty, but because every path seemed to run straight into someone else's jurisdiction. Commander Mark Beckner took over the investigation and ordered a fresh review. 78 tasks were listed, 40 checked off, more pending. The closer his team looked, the less optimistic they became that a quiet, behind-the-scenes agreement with the district attorney would ever appear. Grand juries were rare in Boulder County. They were blunt instruments, secret, powerful, and politically risky. But by early 1998, Bettner and his advisors, including the outside dream team of attorneys, began to see it as one of the only remaining levers. A grand jury could do what the police on their own could not: compel reluctant witnesses to testify under oath, subpoena documents that lawyers resisted turning over, force the district attorney's office itself to control the case in a structured way. The move also carried a not-so-quiet threat. If 12 citizens heard the evidence and voted to indict, and the DA refused to act, that refusal would live in the record, even if sealed. Around this time, stories began to circulate of internal notes and summaries said to come from inside the DA's orbit. They would later be known in true crime circles as the Bonita Papers, leaked narratives that claimed to capture early strategy sessions, suspicions, and frustrations from within Boulder's walls. Never authenticated, never treated as official, they still painted a vivid picture of a house divided. Detectives pushed hard on the family. Some prosecutors worried about reasonable doubt, others worrying about politics. Whether every line in these supposed summaries is accurate or not, the atmosphere they describe is hard to miss. By the time anyone uttered the words grand jury out loud, trust between key players was already thin. In March of 1998, District Attorney Alex Hunter formally agreed a grand jury would be convened to help move the investigation forward. At least, that's how it was phrased in public. Grand jury proceedings are built on silence. No cameras, no public transcripts, no defense attorneys in the room. Only prosecutors, witnesses, and 12 citizens who have suddenly found themselves holding a family's future. For this panel, the task was enormous. They weren't asked to solve the case in some cinematic revelation. They were asked something more narrow and more unnerving. Is there enough probable cause to say that someone, in this room or outside it, should be charged? Witnesses arrived one by one. Some were known to the public. Friends who'd been at Christmas parties, neighbors who'd spoken to reporters, doctors whose name had surfaced in coverage. Others were experts, forensic scientists, handwriting analysis, crime scene technicians who could walk jurors through photographs frame by frame. But we know the broad strokes of what this panel was shown: the condition of the basement room, the construction of the ligature, the ransom note and its odd mix of familiarity and attempted menace, the early DNA results, partial profiles, not tying neatly to the household, the conflicting interpretations of prior medical findings. Detectives who believed the answer lay inside the family laid out their case. Unusual behavior, delayed cooperation, contradictions between early statements and later ones, staging elements that felt pointed inward rather than out. Others, including some within Hunter's orbit, were more cautious. They knew what beyond a reasonable doubt looks like in front of a Colorado jury. Whatever this panel decided, the district attorney would still have to stand up in open court and own it. Meanwhile, outside the sealed room, the city moved around a mystery with no public progress. Reporters watched people go in and out of the side door and try to decode expression from posture, from the way someone avoided microphones, from how tightly they held their coat. The law required secrecy. Human nature did not. Bits and pieces of what might have happened inside, who went in, who seemed shaken, who seemed angry, leaked in the conversation, and then in the print. The larger story remained shut behind that heavy door. Amid all of this, one voice inside the district attorney's orbit kept pulling in the opposite direction. Lou Smith was not a Boulder cop. He was a veteran homicide detective from Colorado Springs, brought out of retirement to help. A man whose reputation had been built on difficult, messy cases and quiet, methodical work. From the beginning, Lou Smith looked at the Ramsey case through a lens entirely different from the prevailing narrative. Where many investigators saw a closed household with no viable way in, he saw overload access points and physical details that didn't line up with the assumption of a staged scene. And where others interpreted the evidence as deliberate manipulation by a parent, Smith focused on the elements that felt anything but polished, details that read as frantic, chaotic, or intentionally cruel. Smith also paid attention to the ransom note, which he believed bore the fingerprints of someone mimicking cinematic kidnappings rather than a parent crafting a cover story. He often referenced the movie Ransom, which had been playing in Boulder around that time. In the film, the kidnappers open with a blunt threat: "We have your son. We want $2 million. To Smith, the echo was hard to ignore, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it fit his broader view that the case didn't neatly conform to the family staging theory. To Lou, those parallels weren't coincidence. They suggested the writer was drawing from something they'd seen before, a script, a screen, or a story already rehearsed. Numerous analysts reviewed the ransom note as well. They ranged from Chet Ubowski, CBI forensic document examiner, who concluded Pansy could not be excluded as the author. John and Burke were excluded. Ubowski's comparisons were foundational in the family involvement theory. Gideon Epstein, board-certified forensic document examiner from Seraph Inc., was hired by the Ramsey's legal team. His findings was that Patsy Ramsey was not the writer. His teams argued that the note showed characteristics of deliberate disguise. He rejected the idea that Patsy's writing meaningfully matched. Epstein's conclusions heavily informed the Ramsey's defense strategy. The Secret Service has the most advanced handwriting and threat assessment document labs in the country. They were asked to review the note. Their public conclusion matched CBI. Patsy could not be cleared. John was certainly not the writer. FBI behavioral and threat analysis, while they're not handwriting experts, but they examine the style, tone, structure, and psychological indicators in the note, including the length, unusually long for a real ransom note, the tone, performative, theatrical, movie influenced. The note had blended handwriting disguise and staging indicators. Supervisory Special Agent Ron Walker, though primarily consulting on the kidnapping angle, he reviewed the behavioral meaning of the note. Unnamed FBI forensic linguistic analysts examined phrase origins, syntax, cultural influences, such as Dirty Harry, speed, ransom references. Their report remained sealed, but leaks show strong suspicion of staging. Dr. Arlo West, a forensic audio and doc analyst, he was not part of the original investigation, but later on analyzed handwriting, audio from the 911 call, linguistic cues. He concluded the note was deliberately staged and likely written from someone in the home. The analysis of the note resulted that from the very first line, listen carefully, the tone feels off, not like a desperate criminal, but like a screen villain reading from a script. Even the eerie prediction, "If you want her to see 1997, mirrors the future tense tagline of Escape from New York, a movie set in that very year. The profilers, the style was too polished, too rehearsed. It didn't sound like someone who actually had a child. It sounded like someone pretending to be a kidnapper. And then there's the final line, Victory, SBTC. For nearly 3 decades, no one's cracked what those initials mean. Some think it's military, Subic Bay Training Center. Others call it religious, Saved by the Cross. A few see it as a personal motto, shall be the conqueror. But there's also one more theory, that it means nothing at all. That it was never meant to be solved, only to make the letter sound more dangerous, more cinematic, more fake. Because in a real ransom note, you don't write like a movie villain. You write like someone who wants to get paid and get away. Lou also cataloged a list that would later become central to what people called the intruder theory. The broken basement window, the suitcase underneath that window, the partial shoe print on the basement floor, the marks on JonBenét's skin some believe could match a stun gun, foreign fibers and unidentified male DNA profile that did not clearly align with known samples from the immediate family. He didn't claim these things proved anything on their own, but they mattered to him. When the grand jury convened, Smith brought his case inside, not as a defense lawyer, as a consultant aligned with the DA's offer, at least on paper. He showed jurors photographs of the window well, the grate, the broken pane. He explained how a person, knowing the house, could lower themselves through that narrow opening, step onto the suitcase, reach the floor without leaving obvious marks outside in frozen snow. Then, he did something else. He reenacted it. Smith himself had gone through that very window, feet first, twisting his shoulders, sliding inside. In his view, that demonstration undercut the idea that entry through the basement was impossible. If an intruder can get in, he told them, we have to take that seriously. You can't dismiss it simply because it's inconvenient to your theory. But while he was presenting these possibilities to the grand jury, his confidence in the broader direction of the case was collapsing. He believed the focus on the Ramseys had hardened into something more than suspicion. In his private notes, he would later write that the investigation felt, to him, less like an open search for a killer and more like an effort to justify a conclusion already reached. During the life of that same grand jury, Lou Smith did something else remarkable. He resigned. He walked away from the DA's team while still convinced that an unknown intruder was responsible, and while the panel was still listening to evidence. In his view, he could not, in good conscience, remain part of an effort he believed was unfairly targeting the parents. He left behind his charts, diagrams, and photographs. He carried out his notes, his faith, and a conviction that the case was headed towards the wrong people. Years later, his work would fuel books, documentaries, and debates, shaping an entire counter-narrative to the idea that the answer had to be inside that house. But in the moment, his departure was one more fracture inside an already divided building. By the end of 1998, the grand jury's work was winding down. Inside, the jurors had heard from investigators who believed this was a family crime. They had also heard from experts who said, wait, there are elements here that don't conform neatly to that. They had been shown the ransom note, the medical findings, the rope and broken brush, the partial DNA profiles, and competing interpretations of what each meant. They listened to people who had once eaten at the Ramsey table and now stood under oath, describing small details and uneasy memories. Outside the room, pressure built from every side. Some within law enforcement wanted charges, any charges, to move the case from limbo into court. Others were quietly terrified of trying a high-profile homicide with so many unresolved questions. In the district attorney's suite, the question was as much practical as moral. Could we win? And if we can't, what damage do we do by failing? When the panel finally concluded its work, there was no public reading of charges, no walk to the podium, no name spoken under the phrase indicted for the murder of. One of the grand jury members, Jonathan Webb, later told ABC's The List, who killed JonBenét, that the panel had largely believed the ransom note was written by Patsy Ramsey, and that the intruder theory was weakened by the undisturbed cobwebs near their basement window. According to Webb, the jurors voted to indict, but District Attorney Alex Hunter declined to sign it. When Hunter stepped in front of the microphones, he spoke carefully. The case would not, at this time, move to trial. He did not lay the blame on the grand jury. He simply stated that he would not sign an indictment, that the evidence, as he saw it, was not sufficient to meet his burden in open proof. What the jurors themselves had wanted remained sealed by law. Their deliberations stayed locked away. Whispers of what they had decided, or almost decided, drifted for years. For the public, the message landed bluntly. After years of investigation and months of secret testimony, no one was being charged with JonBenét Ramsey's murder. Inside Boulder's justice system, nothing felt resolved. Detectives who had pushed hard on the family carried away a sense that the window to act had closed. Supporters of the intruder theory saw the non-indictment as proof that the case against the Ramseys was never solid to begin with. And in between those positions, a quieter truth. A child had been killed in her own home. A grand jury had sat, listened, and gone back to their ordinary lives. The file did not close. It simply went back on the shelf, thicker than it was before, heavier with exhibits, no lighter in answers. The story did not stop here. It only moved into a different kind of darkness, one where theories outnumber facts, and where the battle over this case shifted from courtrooms and conference rooms into bookshelves, talk shows, and living rooms. No indictment, no closure, just headlines chasing a soundbite. District Attorney Alex Hunter faced the microphones for less than 5 minutes. His statement, measured, technical, ended the only formal proceedings that had tried to push the case forward. When he stepped away, the crowd surged, shouting the same, "Why not them?" Within an hour, radio hosts filled the gap. Television anchors replayed the same clip until the edges frayed. What the grand jury kept secret, the airways attempted to decode. Experts appeared nightly, diagrams behind them, arrows and timelines drawn from memory. The story became entertainment, repackaged, scored, and sold by the segment. Documentaries promised revelations. Commentators promised motive. Ratings followed. Inside the family circle, phones rang with offers disguised as condolences. Lawyers, agents, journalists, all speaking the same language of access. The Ramseys chose visibility over silence. They went on television, not for confession, but survival, insisting they had nothing to hide. Their book followed, part in statement, part plea. We loved our daughter. We did not harm her. Defamation suits multiplied. Some settled quietly, others stretched for years. Each filing added one more volume to an archive already taller than the child at its center. For viewers, the case split along emotional lines. Faith versus doubt, innocence versus intuition, played out nightly against living room screens. Away from Boulder, Lou Smith kept working. He organized his notes, labeled boxes, rebuilt timelines the public had never seen. Retirement did not quiet him, it focused him. He corresponded with other detectives, with journalists willing to look again at the evidence the courtroom never aired. To some, he was a stubborn believer. To others, the only man who refused to stop asking rational questions. His files would outlive him. Photographs, measurements, a single conviction scrawled in pen. It was not the parents. 2 years later, a breakthrough, or at least the promise of one. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey announced the results of new DNA testing. The unknown male DNA did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. She formally cleared John, Patsy, and Burke, declaring them innocent. Further analysis of the 2008 DNA testing revealed that not only did the results exonerate the Ramsey, but they indicate the presence of one, possibly two, unidentified male profiles. This finding reinforced the belief that at least one unknown intruder was involved, though the source of the second profile remains uncertain. It was official, but Patsy unfortunately did not live to hear it. Patsy passed away on June 24, 2006. She died at the age of 49 in Roswell, Georgia, after a long battle with ovarian cancer. 5 years after Patsy's passing, John Ramsey married his third wife, Jan Rousseau, on July 21, 2011. They met at a mutual friend's wedding in Denver approximately 2 years earlier. Their relationship began romantically, some say, in June 2010, and they later married in Charlottesville, Michigan, the very place the Ramseys had once planned to spend that New Year's together. Every anniversary invited another retelling. Networks reconstructed the house, documentaries reimagined motives, and debates resurfaced. The public became their jury now, one that never adjourned. John Ramsey began appearing at CrimeCon, standing under stage lights that once belonged to detectives and television anchors. He spoke not of guilt or defense, but of science. He called on investigators to release the DNA for advanced forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that solved the Golden State Killer case. He urged Colorado officials to let the science work, insisting the key to JonBenét's killer was already in evidence storage. He became a voice for cold case reform, pushing for laws that would mandate genetic genealogy when traditional methods fail. In 2016, Burke Ramsey sat down with Dr. Phil McGraw for his first public interview, 20 years after his sister's death. Viewers fixated on his quiet tone and awkward smile. Critics called it unsettling. Dr. Phil called it trauma. The mannerisms of a child hidden from the world for decades. Burke said he slept through the tragedy, waking only when his mother came into his room, when someone with a flashlight came into his room, and lastly, when his father told him JonBenet was missing. He denied any involvement, and when CBS later aired a documentary implying otherwise, he sued a $750 million defamation lawsuit that ended in a confidential settlement. By 2019, both CBS and Dr. Warner Spitz had quietly resolved their cases with the Ramseys, and the family's legal victories helped solidify the public record. The DNA evidence excluded them all. Earlier, the Ramseys had filed and settled defamation cases against outlets like Time, Court TV, New York Post, AOL Time Warner, and The Star. A federal judge ruled that a 2002 Fox News report which said investigators suspected the Ramseys was not libelous and dismissed the case. The judge stated that although the broadcast may have left an unfavorable impression, it did not meet the legal standard for defamation. This was a rare victory for the media against the Ramseys. The conflict over DNA never ended. The Boulder Police Department maintains that the sample, the profile of the unknown male, remains under active review with state labs. But critics, including genealogist C.C. Moore, argue that those labs rely on outdated methods. John Ramsey's public plea is simple. Release the sample to a private genetic genealogy lab that can trace the suspect's lineage within days. So far, that request remains unanswered. Technology promises answers the 90s could not, but progress has paused, not for lack of science, but permission. Each side says its duty. Each side claims to be protecting the evidence, and in between them, time keeps moving. Nearly 3 decades have passed. Generations of investigators have come and gone. Each believes that somewhere, inside one piece of evidence already logged, the answer waits. Lou Smith's daughter, Cindy Mara, continued his work. She formed a small investigative team with family members and some of Lou's former homicide colleagues to keep reviewing the evidence. Cindy's daughters Lexa and Jessa have joined her efforts and now host a podcast called The Victim's Shoes, where they discuss their grandfather's notes, theories, and the ongoing pursuit of justice for JonBenét. Wu's friends and family carried his belief that truth doesn't expire with the investigator. If nothing else, Wu had said, you have to stir the pot. And they still do. Technology evolves. Patience rarely does. A single cell could trace a bloodline. An unknown profile could find a name. Yet the evidence that might unlock it remains sealed by procedure. Progress paused by policy. John Ramsey still speaks. Softly now. Less as a man defending himself, more as a father remembering. Regret isn't a statement. It's a shadow that doesn't leave. He still believes someone, somewhere, knows what happened that night. The department calls it an active investigation. The public calls it a ghost. Each winter, a brief press release. Same language, different date. No new information at this time. Years pass, but her story stays within reach. Not because the world can't forget, but because some refuse to. In every generation of investigators, there's one who opens the old box again and quietly whispers, what if we missed something? Some stories don't end with verdicts. They end with a quiet promise that someone will keep watch. A father, a detective, a daughter with a flashlight in her hands. For JonBenét, truth has outlived time. And for those still looking, may the light never go out in that basement window. Subscribe now, because every couple of days we uncover another story that deserves to be remembered.